Senators Barrasso, Ernst, and Scott.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a very interesting few days that we have had on the floor of the Senate. And I'm going to start the discussion this evening because there are some interesting points that have been brought up that really resonate with me as a veteran and as someone who has special interests in Ukraine. Now, in 1989, as a young woman, I attended an agricultural exchange in Ukraine, 1989, while it was part of the former Soviet Union. Now, because of that exchange, I do have some interesting thoughts about Ukraine and how they wanted to be a free and independent nation at that time. And of course, a couple years after that, they did become a free and independent nation. What I find very interesting now is that the House managers are very, very centered on the fact that Russia was invading Ukraine and military funding to Ukraine. When did Russia roll their tanks into Crimea? That was 2014. Obama administration. How did the Obama administration react to that invasion of Ukraine? They reacted by sending blankets. Blankets don't throw lead downrange. This administration, President Trump, provided lethal aid to the Ukrainian people, actually allowed them an opportunity to defend themselves. The House Democrats, these House managers, did nothing of the sort to provide that assistance to Ukraine. And yet now they are on their high horse, about President Trump not doing enough for Ukraine. This administration has done more than the previous administration did when Crimea was being invaded. I have very strong thoughts about that. So as we're being lectured by the House managers about how they are such great friends to Ukraine, got a little information. This year's National Defense Authorization Act, the conference report, which included lethal aid to Ukraine, House Manager Nadler voted no. Last year's National Defense Authorization Act, which included lethal aid to Ukraine, House Managers Lofgren, Jeffries, and Nadler voted no. This year's omnibus, which included defense spending, lethal aid to Ukraine, no. Garcia and Nadler didn't vote. So 4 of the House managers have voted against lethal aid to Ukraine. And they can sit there and lecture about this president not doing enough for Ukraine. This president has done more than they have, and he has done more than the previous administration did. Thank you.
Well, we sat through another day, seems like Groundhog's Day in the Senate, from what we heard from the managers yesterday, the day before. It is the same thing day after day after day. It does seem that after about an hour and a half, they start repeating themselves, as if you could impeach by just kind of repeating the same thing by repetition. We are ready for the president's team to put their defense on. The president didn't have a chance to do that in the House. We have heard plenty from the House now. They say that they've had overwhelming evidence. They said it 11 times in their opening documents. Today, Representative Nadler said there is a mountain of evidence. I am ready to hear from the president's defense. There's a lot of discussion of do we need witnesses or not. This is a very serious issue. The serious thing for the country, taking a president and removing him or her from office. We've never done it in the entire history of the United States. It's not about one witness or another. There is an amount of evidence that the Democrats say they have, which is overwhelming, convincing, rock solid, a mountain of evidence. They've been a couple of days now of opening arguments. It's time for the president to get to have his defense presented, and it's time for the Senate to ask our questions and then make a decision on final judgment, a decision of do we need more information or have we heard enough? There are 4 members of the Senate who are running against the president. Voting is starting in a few days. From Schiff's opening arguments, it sure sounded like me as if he was saying the voters cannot be trusted. He was saying the voters couldn't be trusted in 2016 and the voters can't be trusted in 2020, and he's the one that ought to determine who the president of the United States is. It is time for the voters to speak. They're going to start speaking in 9 or 10 days in Iowa, and the whole country will have a chance to make its decision in November. I say I have a lot more confidence in the voters of the United States to make the right decision for our country.
It seems to me to be very clear what's happening, and this old saying that says that if you say it often enough, it must be true. And the good news is the Democrats have literally bought into that premise that if you just say it often enough, it must be true. And we've heard the same story: rinse it, recycle it, and repeat it. Rinse it, recycle it, and repeat it. And what is that story? The story is that the President of the United States has no responsibility whatsoever to look for injustice, corruption anywhere, even in the 2016 election. And it is a sad day in our nation when, in fact, our Democratic House managers are simply telling the same story over and over again with actual no basis in fact.
That is the big challenge that we're facing right now, is how often we're hearing the same stories. On Tuesday all day, we heard the same stories, the same videos. On Wednesday all day, the same stories, the same video. Manager Schiff started this morning by saying, I'm sorry, we're going to do some of the same things, just in a different context. And again, same stories, same videos all over again to be able to go through it. So our challenge is we want to be able to get to the full story. Apparently they're going to take 3 full days to be able to walk through this. I was trying to take notes today on how many half-truths we were getting, that they were telling part of the story but not telling the other part of the story, where they would talk through the phone call and start talking about the phone call but conveniently leave the sentence out before or the sentence out after. And so I think that my frustration is the American people are getting half the story at this point. There's a proverb 18:17, that says the first one that comes along seems right until they're cross-examined. And I'm looking forward in the days ahead for the first time to finally hearing both sides of the story all the way through September, October, November, December. All it was one side of the story. Now we've heard one side of the story. Apparently we're going to hear it all day again tomorrow, the same things all over again. And then finally we'll get to the other part of the story, and I look forward to getting a chance to be able to hear that.
If you want to more complete story,
about what the Obama administration did about Ukraine lethal aid, do you have any questions about the Trump administration's temporary hold on Ukraine aid?
I don't, because it was a temporary hold, and the president did release that. And please understand too, the aid, what was being held is for the next fiscal year. So being able to direct that money to Ukraine, they are able to use that lethal aid to push back against the Russians in a meaningful manner, which is something the Obama administration never granted for the Ukrainian people.
There were 8 senators in Ukraine, and I was one of them, the weekend that the Russian helicopters landed to take over Crimea. We were supposed to go to eastern Ukraine that Saturday. Freedom fighters were killed that Friday night, and they felt it wasn't safe for the senators to go to Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. They took us out of the country. There are a group of us who have been following this very closely, trying to get lethal aid to Ukraine from that day 5 years ago, continued to be stonewalled by the Obama administration in spite of action by Congress. And all they sent were night vision goggles, blankets, and meals ready to eat. It is President Trump who has provided the lethal aid to the people of Ukraine that is so critical to them. I went with John McCain and Tom Cotton to Dnipropetrovsk in eastern Ukraine at one point. We've met with freedom fighters there, and a number of their colleagues have lost their lives. We know personally the people there and their faces and how important it is to them and has been to them the aid that the United States through President Trump has brought forward that continued to be blocked by President Obama.
I was there. I was in Ukraine February of 2019, and I can tell you I was out on the front lines in Donetsk and was able to meet with the commanding general there, and we went into that old Cold War era bunker. and got a briefing on all of the wonderful abilities that the United States has been able to provide to Ukraine to give them at least a fighting chance to push back against the Russians. But one thing before we close, I am very encouraged to hear the type of support coming from the House Democrats on how they believe that we need to provide lethal aid ongoing to Ukraine and make sure our own military members in Europe are outfitted properly. I am excited that all of these members are going to be supporting our United States military men and women as we bring up defense spending, whether that's the new Space Force, whether it's autonomous vehicles, AI, and hypersonics, all of those things we need to push back against Russia. I am glad to know that they are going to be supporting and that they've publicly stated that.
Jay Sokolow is here.